Welcome and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Here we are with the screen share. So we were actually in the middle of a Torah Temimah when we had to quit the last time. And of course, the topic is the very last Parsha of the Torah, which we will read next Tuesday night, next Tuesday night and Wednesday. And that's Vezot HaBracha, when we read about this final blessing that Moses gives to the Jewish people right before he passes on, which is sort of a lovely moment when you think about that.
Rabbi,
Yes,
I got a question.
sure.
He blessed all the tribes except Simon's tribe. Why didn't he bless Simon's tribe? He left that out.
Yeah, I know.
He blessed, yeah.
But it's, something, I'm aware of that, and you're absolutely right. And I'm not sure. I believe what happened subsequently is the tribe of Shimon became absorbed into the tribe of Judah. Remember, Shimon and Levi were the two sons who committed that,
Yeah, they killed everybody for their sister. Their sister, yeah.
Right, the issue of Shechem, and Jacob was humiliated in some ways by what they did,
Yeah.
and neither of them received a possession in Israel. So Levi, of course, managed to do that in a positive way because subsequently they showed tremendous loyalty to God and were thus rewarded. So it's interesting that both prophecies could come true. They did not get a portion in the land of Israel. Shimon did get a portion in the land of Israel, but subsequently became absorbed into the tribe of Judah, which again sort of is an interesting thing because, of course, the other tribes, although it talks about the 10 tribes, the lost tribes, so they survived because Judah survived, and Benjamin, of course, also sided with Judah when the kingdom split. So if I'm not telling you, if I'm not making this up, and I'm trying to sort of dig into my memory regarding this. And maybe, I don't know that we'll get to it, whether there'll be any comment on that by Rashi. But you're right. It is something that is very strange. It is strange. All right, so what happened was, remember, this whole poem starts with Moses praising God, but also praising Israel in that regard, and basically saying that they deserve God's blessings. In other words, he's trying to set up a case for justification of this blessing, and that's sort of an interesting thing to think about. And so we had that, this Hashem, this verse where it says, it starts here, right? Hashem misinai ba, right? This is opening words, right? The Lord came from Sinai and shone on Seir, to them in Seir, and went to Har Paran, and then arrived with some myriads of his angels. Okay, and that gives rise to that story about how God offered the Torah to all the other peoples before he offered it to the Jewish people. And Baruch Halevi Epstein explains that the reason behind that is so that they wouldn't be able to use the excuse that the reason they didn't observe Torah is they were never given the opportunity. They were given the opportunity. But there's something beyond that I sense, which is that generally in where this Midrash is spelled out, is that each tribe or each nation sort of says, or the examples that are given is that they have some basic value that goes against a value of the Torah. So they always say to God, well, what's written in it? And then God quotes, like with Ishmael, he says, thou shalt not kill, and they say no, because it says, by thy sword you shall live. And I think I have explained this before in the previous shiur that we had, is that what this is telling us is that if, in fact, we are going to hold fast to a personal or cultural value that goes against the values of the Torah, we are going to have a hard time accepting Torah. So somehow And of course this has been an important issue for me personally, is to try and understand the Torah and to finesse it in such a way that if there is a value that I think is a value of peace and love and compassion, and somehow the Torah seems to be speaking against it, to try and understand the Torah in a way where I can harmonize those two particular issues. We've talked about, so a good example I can give you is, like, for example, when it talks about enemies, right? Well, who are those enemies? Are they external enemies, or are they enemies within ourselves? And I feel the Torah is speaking very much about the enemies within ourselves. Was it Pogo's great saying, right? We're our own worst enemy, and to recognize our own self-destructive values, and to try and allow the Torah to move us away from those self-destructive values. And I think that's actually a very, sort of a cardinal principle within interpretation and understanding the Torah. So, there's a joke about this too, by the way. That when God offered it to the other people, they said, "What's in it?" And just as I explained, the joke version of it goes, and when he came to the Jewish people, they said, "How much does it cost?" That's what they said to God. And God said, "It doesn't cost anything." And the Jewish people said, "Well, in that case, we'll take 2 tablets." So, anyway, that's the joke version of it. All right.
Pretty good.
Yes. All right. So going on here, he says something very lovely. Uvazeh mitbaer lashon hapirke de Rabbi Eliezer, Perek Mem Aleph. He says, and in understanding what, in this comment that we were just talking about, is clarified the language of this is a Midrash called Pirke de Rabbi Eliezer. It actually exists in translation in English. I have a copy of this. It's a major Midrash. I believe it has certain mystical, sort of mystical elements to it as well. I'm not very familiar with this at all. But anyway, it's chapter 41, B'inyan Zeh, regarding this particular matter. Ve'zeh Lashono. So this is quote, right? This is his language of the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Zarach Mehar Seir. He shone from Mount Seir. Umisham Chazar, and from there he returned, Venigla al Yishmael, and from there he revealed himself to the Ishmaelites. Umisham Shalach l'Sha'ar Ha'omed, and from there he went to all the other nations. This is what Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer says. Mevu'ar, and I believe this is now Baruch HaLevi Epstein speaking. Shel-l'sha'ar ha'omot lo chazar ba'atzmo. So it's using this language, right? It says shalach. That's what he's pointing out. It doesn't say he appeared, but that he sent emissaries, right, to the other nations. And he says this clarifies that to the other nations, lo chazar ba'atzmo, he did not appear in his own essence, right? God didn't appear directly to them, rak shalach lahem, but rather sent them emissaries, right? V'tzarich tam. So what's the reason for this? That's what he's saying. It needs splainin, right? Needs an explanation. Ach, so in other words, when you just come across this in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer without any background whatsoever, you have to wonder, why is Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer saying this? On what basis? Ach al pi hasvara shekatavnu. But when you look at how we explain it, in other words, the specific nations that the Torah says, which is specifically Yishmael and Esau, remember we said, he explained, Baruch HaLevi Epstein explained, that the reason why the Torah says Esau and Ishmael is because, of course, they have a direct relationship because they are direct descendants of Abraham and Isaac. And that's the reason why they're explicitly stated in the Torah, right? So given that, right, having had that explanation that they had that special relationship, Yesh Lomar, you can say, Demipnei Yichusam Shel Esav v'Yishmael, because of the particular relationship of Esau and Ishmael, El HaTorah, to the Torah, mipnei kvod avotehem, on account of the honor due to their patriarchs, to their fathers, chazar ba'atzmo. That's why God came in his essence, appeared directly to Esau and Ishmael. So, this is an example. I mean, it's not a long Baruch Halevi Epstein, not a long Torah Temimah, but, I just have to stand back in awe of this brilliance, right? This, first of all, to know and to be able to quote from these various sources. I mean, there's so much. There's an ocean of sources, and how he's able to put together this kind of stuff. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm so grateful to have been exposed to this kind of stuff. And, I'd love if I only had the energy and the time to sort of go through almost every single, go through this entire thing and see how he takes things to another layer of meaning and deconstruction and stuff like that. So I'm sharing it with you in the hopes that you appreciate that too and can sense how lovely this is. All right. Ready to go on to something else, unless you have a comment and you would like to just say anything. Okay. I will take silence as an indication that I need to move on. So I think we have this. Okay. So Ata, he arrived, he came, right? And Rashi explains, Le Yisrael. And he arrived to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. Merivavot Kodesh. And Rashi explains that the grammar here is confusing because mi means from, and indeed here me har paran, from Mount Paran, and again up here it was mi seir, from Seir, and he says be careful, it doesn't mean he came from Rivavot Kodesh. There is no place called Rivavot Kodesh, and I did explain this the last time, but that the may is known as the partitive article as well, and he spells it out. Ve'imo miktzat Rivavot Malachei Kodesh. He says with God, he arrived with some of the myriads of holy ones, right? So, and with him a certain number of the myriads Malachei Kodesh, of the holy angels, velo kulam, and not all of them, velo ruvam, nor most of them, velo kederech, here we go, basar vadam, and not in the way of literally flesh and blood, but it means mortals, shemar'eh kol kvod oshro, who tends to display all of his wealth, all the honor of his wealth, v'tifarto, and his glory, beyom chupato, on his wedding day. So this is actually lovely too. I love these sort of cultural connections, right? Because weddings tend to be on the lavish side, and people spend, thousands of dollars, or we certainly read in the paper sometimes, when we read about a celebrity getting married, and it's this, huge exposure of wealth, display of wealth, etc. I mean, it's interesting because in some ways it shows a certain human nature. I mean, Rashi isn't necessarily criticizing, I agree, I don't think, but also showing that, that God, given God's undescribable power, doesn't show off, because in a sense it is showing off, but in another way, of course, it isn't showing off, and it is trying to, express and share one's fortune and wealth with a group, with the people who are invited to the wedding, that they should share your joy and live in your splendor a little bit. So, you can look at things in more than one way. So here we are. Eishdat, right? Eishdat, what this word is he says, this is a little note for the Torah, and he says, bet milin kare. He says, you need to read this as two words, as eish and dat. We talked a little bit about this, as I recollect. We tried to interpret why it's called this, right? Shehaita ktuva me'az lefanav, because I'm going over stuff we did before, but regardless, because prior to this, me'az, from of old, it was written before him, be'esh shchora al gabe esh levana, with black fire on white fire. Natan lahim beluchot, and he gave it to them on the tablets, katav yad yamino, with his right hand. Now, there's a lot of symbolism going on here, right? Exactly the significance of black fire on white fire, I would have to meditate on that or see if I could find interpretations of what is being meant by, black fire on white fire. Is black fire supposed to be, again, we talked about fire before, I mentioned, right, about how fire essentially represents transformation, right? A reaction of some kind, and how Torah is transformative, which it is. But regardless, what is one positive, is one negative? And I just occurred to me right this second, okay, that we could be talking about the positive mitzvahs, right, as opposed to the negative mitzvahs, because it involves both positive acts and also withholding doing things that are destructive. So maybe that's what the black fire and white fire refer to. Okay, so here we go. Davar acher, a different. Also, the fact that it was given with his right hand. So symbolically, when you give something, if you are right-handed and you give something with your right hand, the symbolism is, since you have more control over your right hand than your left hand, that the symbolism is that you're giving it with a full heart. That what you're doing when you're giving with your right hand, you mean that you totally want to do this. You know what you're doing, and you're doing it willingly. So, in other words, the idea that God loved the Jewish people, and at that particular point, this act of giving them the Torah was such a deep act of love, of divine love. Right? Davar acher, another interpretation. Eish dat, and I'm going to have to figure this out. Wow. I had at one point, because this looks like a mem here, which couldn't be because it's a final letter. Wow.
It says Katargamo. Targumo.
Thank you. So there's a vav here. Thank you. Okay. Eshdat, a fiery law. Ketargumo, meaning like the Targum translates it. Okay. And here it is. Eshata, right? You can hear the relationship to Hebrew of Aramaic here. Or right. Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
Here it says Shanatana Lahem Mitoch Ha'esh.
That's the Rashi, right? He's translating. I was going into the
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. You just were anticipating where I was going with it. That's all right. Okay. So here we go. All right. Ketav Yamina, right? The writing with a W of his right hand. Migoy, from Eshata, fire, Oraita Yahav Lana, Torah, right? Torah, or light, he gave to us. But Oraita generally means, like de Oraita, it means teaching, right? But it seems to be related to the light of learning, which of course appears to be a universal metaphor, right? So he says, Eshdat ketargamo shinatna lahem, that he gave it to them, mitoch, from the midst, ha'esh, of the fire. Remember, think back on the Exodus narrative with giving of the Ten Commandments. Okay, I will do the best I can with the next little piece. It's a long Rashi, as you can see, all the way from here, all the way down to there. But I'll do the best I can right now. Af chovev amim. So this sounds like he indeed loved. Now, amim generally means nations, but the tradition is that this is referring to the tribes, right? So, indeed, he loved the tribes, Kol kedoshav biyadecha, all his holy ones are in your hand. Again, so we know that in prayer, for example, in the Siddur, if you analyze how those prayers go, they move quite often from second person to third person and back. They move back and forth between addressing God in the second person and referring to God in the third person. And of course, I think there is some lovely, probably spiritual psychology involved in that particular dynamic. Vehem tuku leraglecha. Now, I believe the word tuku, which I am not familiar with, right? They, that is the Israelites, right, the Jewish people, tuku leraglecha. So I think it means something like they encamped at your feet, right? So we're thinking of them. I mean, the image that I have is the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai, right? Yisa midabrotecha. So again, I'm sort of guessing here, but Yisa would mean they journeyed, or he journeyed, midabrotecha, from your commands, from your statements. Okay? Now, I think again, because this is poetry, and that's what makes it so difficult, because with poetry, you're trying to jam meaning into language, which goes beyond simple, direct connotations and even denotations. You're just moving heavily, right? This is a very heavy text, right? So, we know that the Israelites journeyed, they had the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, etc., which would let them know when they had to journey and where they had to go. But please understand, I think that is also metaphorical for the Torah itself, which, of course, guides our personal journeys through life. And the idea of being willing, right? Willing to conquer our own personal wills, right? And what we want to achieve, and allow that to be a gift to, I would say, both to God and to the ones we love. And I think that's really what loving is about, is the sacrifice of one's own will to the one you love, and the trust you have that they will do the same to you, that they will feel that way towards you as well. And that's an amazing place to be. All right, so we'll take a look at the Rashi here. Af chovev amim, right? Gam, also, chiba yetera, an additional amount of love, chivev et hashvatim. He loved the tribes. So he absolutely adored the tribes. Kol echad ve'echad karui am. So Rashi's explaining the term amim here, which normally you would think refers to the nations, right, of the world, that he's explaining that each tribe was referred to as a as a nation. Shahare, because we have Binyamin levado, because Benjamin alone, haya atid lehivaled. And he says, because at the time where this expression was made, back during the life of Jacob, we're going back here to try and extract the meaning, okay, that Benjamin alone was to be born in the future. Keshe'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when the Holy One, blessed be He, said LeYaakov, to Jacob, in Bereshit Lamed He, in Genesis chapter 35, Goy v'kahal goyim. There we go. A nation and an assembly of nations, yeh mimcha, there will be from you. So since at that point, right, he had 11 of his 12 sons, and that could have referred to all of them, right, as a group. But because Benjamin had not been born yet, right, we're counting Benjamin as a goy himself, as a nation himself. And that's essentially how this notion that each tribe is considered an or a goy individually is extracted. So it's sort of an inductive argument, as I recollect from mathematics. Kol kedoshav biadecha, all his holy ones are in your hands. This is beautiful. Nefashot hatzadikim, The souls of the righteous, genuzot ito, are hidden away with him. Ki inyan shinemar, in the same manner as is stated, and this would be Shmuel Aleph Vav Hey. This is a very beautiful verse from the first book of Samuel, chapter 25. And this is where Abigail is. There's a story between Abigail and Nabal, who was married to Nabal at the time, and David at that point wasn't a king yet, but he was a leader. He had a band that went with him. And Nabal, this Abigail's husband, was acted in a disgusting way to David. He wouldn't grant him any hospitality at all, and may have even insulted him as well. At any rate, Nabal had this bad temper, and basically he kind of had a heart attack, you might say. Just he got so angry, etc. And of course, and Abigail recognized the one, how great David really was, and she was actually trying to save her husband, I think, at the time. This happened before Nabal basically died, but anyway, she says to David, so lovely words, Vayeta nefesh Adoni, and may the soul of my Lord, she's referring to David, Tzurah, be bundled up, bitzror hachayim, in the bundle of life, et Hashem Elokecha, with the Lord your God. So she basically is blessing David and wishing him immortality. And we have this concept of Tzror HaChayim, right? We say that in the El Malay Rachamim. We actually quote from Abigail's blessing to David. So it's just being bundled into the bundle of life. Okay. So here we go. Vehem tuku leraglecha, right? And I said, Lauren, I don't know if you have a better translation, because I'm kind of guessing this word tuku. Forgive me. I mean, I did look it up, and I didn't write.
They say centered at your feet.
Oh, toch, from the word toch. Very nice. Thank you. Toch is from, like, in the midst, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's lovely. That's a lovely translation, right? So I'll just quote you, right? And they centered at your feet. Vehem re'uyim lechach. And the Jewish people deserve this. Remember, Rashi said at the beginning that in praising God, he also winds up praising the Jewish people as well, to say how worthy they are. So he says, and indeed, they are worthy, okay, of this. Sha'arei tuku atzmam letoch tachtit hahar, because they centered themselves into the midst. There's this word toch and tuku, right? Tachtit hahar, the under part of the mountain, leraglecha, at your feet, besinai, at Mount Sinai. Okay, so here we go. Tuku. So Rashi understands, right? Rashi knows that we're going to have, and of course I'm reading this, he knows that Mordechai Miller is going to have a hard time understanding this word tuku, right? So he says, Lashon pa'alu. This denotes an action, right? They did. Hitvaku. So he says, and he shows us this word, right? So
passive, by the way.
Really?
Passive conjugation, yeah, but it does say hitvachu.
Well, hitvachu is reflexive.
So it says they allowed themselves to be placed.
Ah, nice. Yeah, had it said nifalu, I would have understood it to mean passive, and that's why I didn't translate it that way. Okay, but it really, here it doesn't, it doesn't seem so clear, that particular explanation, I have to tell you truthfully, right? Because here it looks as if they did it, pa'alu, they did it, right? I'm just saying the language here, I find then confusing, right? Hitvaku, they because this is reflexive. In other words, they placed themselves, right? They centered themselves, right? Because we can use center as a verb, right? They centered themselves, letoch margalotecha, into the midst of your feet, right? Something like that. Okay. Yisa medabrotecha, Nas'u alehem ol Toratech. This is so lovely. Okay, so the word dabar, right, is a cattle prod, right? And the word ledaber is in fact associated with this word that means cattle prod. Because as I've explained at other times, that when you say ledaber, there's a harsh element to it, which doesn't exist with the word amar, right? So amar very often will translate to say, and daber we will say has the connotation of speak, all right? And the different connotation of those two words. At any rate, he's taking it this way, and he says, Nasu alehem, they placed upon themselves ol Toratecha, the yoke of your Torah. And I would imagine that at this point, okay, the idea of yoke of the Torah you can understand, because it all has to do with the fact that the yoke is placed on an ox to prevent the ox from simply going in whatever direction it wants to go. And the yoke is this lever by which the person, the owner of the ox, can guide the ox to where it needs to go. And of course, the fact that we naturally resist the notion of being commanded, we don't like being told what to do. Does that sound familiar? To the fact that when the Torah tells us to do things that, like keeping kosher or keeping Shabbos or not doing certain things, and we resist it, we don't want to do it. But in our case, that's why they describe the Torah as a yoke, right? To say that it is actually a sign of great character, right? To be willing to accept the yoke of the Torah. There's nothing new about it. It's not modernity hasn't shown us how tough the Torah is to follow. But when you conquer yourself and you conquer your own will, that's already the start of this. Midabrotecha. He says, okay, so hamim bo karov liyasod. So he says that this mem isn't the partitive mem here, right? He says it is connected to the basic meaning of the word, kamo. So here we go, right? In Numbers 7, Vayishma et hakol medaber elav. So you see the mem is actually part of a verbal construction, right? He heard the voice speaking to him, right? Yechezkel bet, Ezekiel chapter 2. Oh, it's past. I'm sorry. We are out of time. Wow. Okay. Wow. So I will need to pop an arrow in here. See if I can do that. Yeah, there it is. There we are, the big arrow. All right. And possibly tomorrow we'll continue. Okay. We'll put it right there. And I'm going to stop the share. Thank you. Hold on one second. Sorry. And I'm going to stop the recording.